He knows what we don't, that you can't have resurrection life without death. You can't have a resurrection unless there's been a death. That seems so obvious, yet we all remain wary of going through the death or any other bad situation that God has the power to overrule for good. I mean, intellectually we know that nothing is impossible with God, that He has the power to thwart anything Satan tries to throw at us. But with our limited perspective, sometimes it feels impossible to remember resurrection when we're staring death in the face. But what else can we conclude from John 11 than that Jesus purposely didn't heal Lazarus? He let Lazarus die and then told the disciples he was happy about it. Let's look at this passage again. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard of Lazarus' illness, he stayed where he was 2 days longer. Only then did he say to the disciples, let's go back into Judea. Jesus loved Lazarus, so when he heard Lazarus was going to die, he stayed right where he was. Does that make any sense? Why would Jesus do that? There's only one reason why he would do that, right? Jesus wasn't angling for a healing. He was setting up a resurrection. And then in verse 15, Jesus says, and hey, I'm glad I wasn't there when he died. Wow. That seems a little bit insensitive, doesn't it? I'm glad I was traveling. I'm glad I couldn't heal him. But why was he glad? For your sakes, that you may learn to believe. Because you have no idea what you're about to see. So Jesus is saying that he's glad he wasn't able to stop Lazarus from going to sleep. Because Lazarus isn't dead, right? Did you catch that? Right before this, Jesus says this whole thing about how Lazarus' illness isn't going to kill him. And then right before they go back, Jesus says, okay, now Lazarus has gone to sleep and I'm going to wake him up. And the disciples don't understand what he's talking about. So he has to specify, no, he's in a tomb, not a bed. And that's another sermon for another time. But just realize that God does not look at Lazarus' condition as death. Lazarus is sleeping, and Jesus is going back to Judea to be the alarm clock. And Jesus was excited for the disciples because of what they're about to witness. And he set the whole thing up. I mean, Jesus didn't bring the illness on Lazarus, obviously. Sickness and suffering are caused by Satan and the sin that he has brought into this world. But God can override that. Speaking of which, Jesus says, I'm glad I wasn't there to heal Lazarus. But did he even have to be there to heal Lazarus? No. He could have healed Lazarus with a thought. One thought from hundreds, even thousands, even millions of miles away, and the sickness in Lazarus' body would have vanished. We've seen Jesus do it before in the Gospels. But Jesus didn't do that. And even after the messengers arrived to tell him that Lazarus was sick, he stayed right where he was for 2 more days with his disciples, so that by the time they returned to Bethany, Lazarus would have been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, why was that important? Well, apparently in the 1st century A.D., it was a common Jewish belief that when a person died, their spirit hovered around the body for up to 3 days, looking for a chance to re-enter. So even after a person had died, many Jews believed that it was possible for them to spontaneously sort of come back to life during this initial 3-day period. But not after. That's probably why there wasn't any huge ruckus after Jesus resurrected the son of the widow of Nain. After all, he wasn't even in his tomb yet. Jesus came by and took his hand and helped him to set up. But anybody who didn't want to believe in Jesus could have simply argued, well, his soul found a way to re-enter his body. And the same with Jairus' daughter, whom Jesus had also raised from the dead. She wasn't in her tomb yet either, although sufficient time must have passed that news had spread through the village and a crowd of mourners had already arrived there at her house. You might remember from that story that Jesus also used the sleeping language then too. Stop wailing, he said to those mourners. She's not dead, she's only sleeping. And they laughed at him because they knew she had died. However, when she came out alive, it was probably pretty easy to shrug off because she hadn't been dead for very long. Certainly not 4 days. See, the Jews believed that on that 4th day, the spirit would give up and finally leave the body for good and go off to Sheol or Hades or wherever they believed it went. And then there was no more hope for life without divine intervention. Also, in the hot climate of the Middle East, where there was no embalming, and isn't even to this day, by the 4th day after death, a body would already be in a stage of advanced decay, and the stench would have been overwhelming. So when Jesus showed up in Bethany 4 days after Lazarus died, and he called him back to life from the dead and healed his rotted, stinking corpse, there was zero doubt that Jesus was the true Messiah. The people that kept asking Jesus for a sign and another sign, please, suddenly had irrefutable evidence. All because Jesus stayed with his disciples in Perea for an extra 2 days. That's why Jesus said, I'm glad I wasn't there for your sakes, because you're about to see something that is going to change everything. Think about what they were going to see. They knew Jesus. By this time, they had been with him for 3 years. They'd seen him work countless miracles, turning water into wine, multiplying food, healing scores of people, casting out demons, controlling the weather with a word. Sure wish I had that power. Walking on water, even bringing people back to life shortly after they died. And now they were about to witness the ultimate miracle of miracles. Totally recreating a person whose body had begun to rot in the tomb. If you knew a person who could do all those things, and you also knew that this person was the most gracious, compassionate, and loving person you had ever met, and you also knew that this person loved you as if you were the only person on the face of the earth, tell me, what would you be afraid of? Would there be anything that could happen to you that would be beyond the power of this person to handle? What could come against you that he could not take care of? What could snatch you out of his hand? Not trouble, not hardship, not persecution, not famine, not nakedness, not danger, not weapons, not angels or demons, not even death itself. That kind of sounds like a Bible verse, doesn't it? No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. What suffering could come to the disciples that God couldn't turn for their good in his time? Is there anything that could separate them from his love? And so now, I ask you, what suffering could come to us that God cannot turn for our good in his time? Is there anything that can separate us from his love? We know there's not. At least we say there's not. But I confess that in the middle of the storm, when the one that you know has the power to calm the storm with his hand isn't calming the storm with his hand, it's hard to wait and watch and trust that he knows what he's doing. But that's the whole point of trust, isn't it? Jesus calmed the storm so we would know he can calm the storm and trust him when he doesn't. Jesus healed the sick so we would know that he can heal the sick and trust him when he doesn't. Jesus raised the dead so we would know that he can raise the dead and trust him when he doesn't. And sometimes he doesn't because he has bigger and better blessings in store than the ones that come from the temporary reprieve of suffering. After all, you don't get the resurrection without the death. You don't get the testimony without the test. You don't get the rainbow without the rain. I'm convinced that all of God's greatest blessings, the truly big ones, are only revealed after we've walked through the valley of the shadow with him. Because it's only then that we see two things. First, that the very best blessing of all is the companionship of Jesus Christ that comes as we go through that valley. And second, that God is a masterful genius in taking everything Satan has meant for harm and turning it for good instead. God is making everything beautiful in his time. So I don't know what storms you've traveled through in the past, or what storms you're in the middle of right now. I don't know what storm may be brewing just on your horizon. But no matter what you're dealing with, I do know this. God is with you in it. And he has promised to make it beautiful in his time. Sometimes that will mean that we can't understand why he would allow things to happen the way he does. But I guarantee you, before long, you're going to be like Mary and Martha, standing at the tomb and watching. And you're going to see everything that you thought was dead and gone forever springing back to new and abundant life. And that moment is going to make all of the suffering we've been through now, all the tears, all the doubts, all the fear and the anxiety, it's going to make that all seem like a hazy memory. We should remind each other of this often when we're struggling. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to cry. It's okay to suffer. But just don't ever forget, this isn't the end. There's a saying that I love, and I have no idea where I read it or heard it or where it came from, but I quote it a lot whenever I think of it, and it's this: If everything isn't okay, it's not the end. Don't you love that? In the end, everything will be okay. If everything isn't okay, it's not the end. God knows what he's doing. If he's acting, it's for our good. And if he's not acting, it's for our good. It's because he's doing something even better than we can imagine. Trust him. He's making everything beautiful in his time.